Alrighty, and we're on.
Awesome. This is very exciting.
So I'm sitting here with Jasmine Capell or Capel, depending on whether you're from the North Island or the South Island. So you're the pastor here?
Yeah, I'm one of the co-ministers.
Co-ministers, okay. So, help me out here because I don't know what the difference in the terminology is. So what's the difference between a minister and a pastor?
I think that just different denominations have a slightly different label.
Okay, all right. So it's just a different label for the same, essentially
same job,
Yep.
looking after the church.
Yep.
And that can include the people who are part of the church and also the community that we're, wanting to reach into and be part of.
Yep. Okay, cool. So before we get into that and how, you ended up in ministry, let's pull it back a little bit because I think people may have picked up on the slight accent there. Yeah. So where were you born?
Yeah, I was born in a little town in the south island of New Zealand.
Yep.
So if you can think of mountain ranges, ski fields, and a lake, Wanaka is where I call home originally.
Okay, and so my geography is shocking. So the South Island is where Auckland is? Like is Auckland on the South Island?
No, Auckland is the North Island,
okay.
And then Christchurch where the earthquake was, and then if people are into adventure tourism, then they might know Queenstown, which is an hour south of where I'm from.
Okay, all right. So for those Lord of the Rings fans, is that the area? Is that
exactly?
The area to go?
That's it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And what would be your first memory of growing up in that area?
Oh, the smell of cut grass.
Yep.
I know that's and pine trees and just fresh air. I think that was a big part of my childhood.
Okay. And so did you guys have a house or what was it?
Yeah, originally just a house in town, and it's a community that's surrounded by farms. So some of my classmates, they were on farms, so they would truck in on the school bus. It might be an hour or so for them.
Yep.
But I was one of the townies.
Okay.
So there's a slight divide there.
Yep.
And that was in a really small town. So I knew basically everyone. I worked at the local supermarket.
Okay.
And knew most people by name.
Wow. Okay. And then so when you were growing up, did you have any inkling what it was that you wanted to do as from a career perspective and a occupation perspective?
Yeah, I think it was on my 9th birthday. My mum got me a badge that said "Future Prime Minister." So I really, Jacinta beat me to it. But that was my ambition, and my mum really supported me in that because she had heard that even the parents get chauffeured around. Yep. So she was,
that's what she wanted.
She wanted
to get in on that experience.
Yeah. No, I think I came from, because it was an adventure capital, mountains, snow, water activities. Tourism was part of the thing that I was thinking about. Okay. I might be doing something in that industry.
Yep.
And then that fitted with my Japanese study.
Okay.
So I was really fortunate actually when I did work experience. I went to the biggest resort in our town and I worked there for a week, and I realised that actually I couldn't work in the tourism industry because it's so, people come in and they go out, and that's not really me. I like being able to,
I like connection.
Exactly.
Yep. Okay. So then what would be like, so what kind of a girl were you at school? How would you describe yourself? So
I was a tomboy.
Yep.
Yeah, I love playing sports, not so good at studying.
Yep.
Would rather be running around outside.
Yep.
Yeah. I have a lot of accidents in my life, like stories like that. I remember, like you're talking about early memories, things like I wanted to be able to ride down the hill standing on the seat of my bike.
Yep.
And I came a cropper. So I just loved doing adventurous stuff. And after my parents split up and my dad got remarried, there were 3 stepbrothers into the picture as well as my younger brother. So there was always, some sports going on in the backyard. We were expected to entertain ourselves.
Yep. So prior to the breakup and the stepbrothers, did you have any other siblings?
Yes, I have one younger brother.
One younger brother. Yep. Okay. And then I'm curious, like when that sort of unfolded for your parents, like how did you take that personally? Like what age were you?
Yeah, I was 4 when they split up and we moved to Christchurch where my grandparents were. And I think my mum did a really good job of trying to make that as normal as possible.
Yep.
But to leave everything that you've known, the only home you've known, I think is a massive thing for kids.
Yep.
And she protected us from that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they decided they would try to figure it out. So we came back 18 months later.
Yep.
So I admired that they wanted to try and work through it.
Yep.
But that wasn't to be. So.
Yep. Okay. And then from an emotional standpoint, were you aware? Like, I think at 4 years old, it's pretty hard to be aware of exactly what's going on, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think you just understand that your dad isn't around.
Okay.
And you're not in the home that you know.
Yeah. Okay.
And now you've got new friends that you've got to get to know in a new school and a new environment.
Yep. So then how was it when I guess you had to start forming those relationships with your stepbrothers? Was there any animosity to begin with, or was it all very amicable? Like, how old were you when that came through?
Yeah, I think I would have been about 6 or 7.
Yep.
And the dynamics are really interesting with those boys themselves.
Yep.
Unfortunately, the oldest one passed away, but
oh wow.
So yeah, very different personalities.
Yep.
And trying to get a hold of those dynamics.
Yep.
And then also, I guess, as the only girl,
yep.
and also wanting to look after my younger brother so that he wasn't bullied or left out or anything like that.
Yep.
I felt it was a huge challenge to go from this is my life during the week to weekends, with my dad and his new family.
Yeah.
And one of the things I really admire about my mum, because I didn't find that very comfortable going into that sort of environment on the weekends, and to adjust to my dad having a new family as well.
Yep.
And she said to me one time, it's not that your dad doesn't love you,
yep.
But he's got a new family and he's figuring that out. But you need to think that the love that he has for you he's not going to take that away and give it to,
yep.
the boys. He's just, his heart is like a factory. He's going to manufacture enough love to cover everyone.
Yep.
So I thought she did a really good job of trying to allay the fears of, a 6-year-old
yep.
that they're going to lose their dad.
Yeah,
actually, it's not that.
Get replaced. Yeah, it's funny actually because Ange and I, we had that discussion when we were thinking about how many kids we wanted to have, right? And when Cadence was born, right, like for me it was very emotional. Obviously, my first child.
Yeah.
It's a girl, and then I don't care what anyone says if they think I'm sexist or whatever, but I think it evoked very like primal emotions in me that here's my baby girl, I want to protect her, and that's how I felt, right? And then, and I had a very different emotional experience when my son was born. Like to me, it was just a different feeling, right? Like, I was proud, like he's a boy and blah, 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 but I didn't have those same sort of very primal sort of emotions that I would attach to it. And then, when we were talking about, whether to have a third or not, and what were we thinking? Sometimes I would say some horrible things like, oh yeah, well, I suppose we got one of each, the third's like a spare. I'd say kind of horrible things like that. But Andrew would always say to me, it's like, your love for each of your children is just different, right? Like it's not that you love one more than the other. You have a different, just like you have individual relationships with different people, different friendships and those sorts of things. The friendship you have with someone is never going to be the same as their friendship with someone else, right? True. So it's the same thing, like the love that I have for each of my kids, it's a different kind of love. So it's not important that they fight against each other for my love. It's more like, let's just work on our individual relationship and what does that look like? And then, for their relationships as siblings, work on their relationships together as well, because, I'm sure Cadence and Harley will have a very different relationship to Cadence and Eden, and likewise Harley to Cadence or Harley to Eden, So, yeah, I really like that. And I think that your mum did a great job in sort of talking that, explaining that, it doesn't mean that they love you any less. If anything, sometimes having more kids, you actually, your heart grows, right, to match, the circumstances.
And I guess I would encourage parents to consider how they can show their love in an equal way.
Yep.
Because in a mixed blended family, that can cause some tension.
Of course.
Kids notice things when they're different,
yep.
And they can make some judgments about that. So Christmas, for example, what the Christmas gifts look like, even something like that can send quite a strong message if it's not done thoughtfully.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So then, what, in school, were you studious, were you academic, or I know you said you were the tomboy, so obviously you look sporty. But, did you do well in school or?
Oh, look, I really went to school for lunchtime. That was my favourite. And I'd go early so I could play basketball,
Yep, okay.
I hate the cold, and so coming to Australia was one of the best decisions for that.
Yep.
But in my town, there wasn't a lot to do, and so basically it was sport or sport.
Yep.
And as a girl, I played netball. But, there's winter mornings where it's freezing cold, below zero freezing is what I mean.
Yep.
You're out in a skirt
Yep.
At 7:30 in the morning. And then I realised that if you play basketball, you get a nice warm stadium on a Friday night.
Yeah, it's indoors.
It's indoors and there's boys.
Okay.
And so I switched, and I was really glad because there was a lot of opportunities to just sort of, scrummage around before school, after school. There was always a pickup game going on. So I wasn't that studious. And at that time, I didn't really understand that, if you put the effort in, you're going to get something out of it. I just thought my intellect was what it was.
Yep.
And it wasn't until I was a straight C student, and I always did things last minute, which my mum was really frustrated about. And I remember the first time that I actually had completed a project, I'd almost finished it. It was on birds. I think I was, maybe in year 5 or 6, and I was so excited that I was on track to hand it in. I had a massive skiing accident that put me in hospital for 3 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And of all the things that I was worried about, it's like, I had done all the work, just about all of it to finish, and I wasn't going to get to hand it in. I remember thinking, why did I work on it at all? I should have just,
Not bothered.
Not bothered, yeah.
So what happened in the skiing accident?
Look, I was just being silly.
Yep.
My school took students up every year, and the weather had come in, so we were just on the learner's slope with the rope tow, and we figured out that if you the exit point for the rope tow, you're meant to get off and then start going downhill. If you go a bit further, there's a snowbank it would pull you up, and then you could sort of jump down.
Okay.
So unfortunately, when I was going up, something happened behind me. I turned around to see what was going on.
Yep.
My hand went into the pulley of the rope tow, into the machinery.
Oh no.
Yeah. So someone fortunately was able to hit the kill switch, but my hand was already munched in the machinery.
Oh.
Yeah, so
Sounds horrible.
It was. You can see I've got a big scar.
Oh wow, and
yeah, and I was lucky I didn't lose my finger.
Yep.
The interesting thing is that at that time the New Zealand government had a compensation system that was a lump sum.
Yep.
And so they recognised that it could be a substantial
injury,
disability for me going forward.
Yep.
And so they gave me a lump sum payment that my mum put aside.
Okay.
And I wouldn't have had the money to go to university, but that money had been sitting there. So that's how I got to go to university.
Okay.
Yeah. And also I think, we were talking about if I was studious or not. I said, I'd rather be playing sport. But I had an incredible opportunity because I was one of just a couple of students who were learning Japanese.
Yep.
And that was partly because there was a ski field that drew a whole lot of snowboarders and skiers from Japan.
Yep.
And so we had an actual teacher
who
had started Japanese in our school. And there was an exchange program. So in year 10, I got a chance to go to Japan for 10 months on exchange, on a scholarship, to a massive girls' school in a massive city, the city of Osaka.
Yep.
So I went as a C student. I came back having seen that students just study really hard.
Yep.
And I thought, that's what I should be doing too. If I'm on scholarship, that's what's expected of me. And I also found that this incredible frustration of not being able to communicate.
Yep.
I wanted to understand, why my host family did what they did and what they were talking about and what was going on TV. I just couldn't understand it.
Yep.
I'd learned enough Japanese to do greetings and that, but not enough to really do life together. So my poor host family, having this person who they couldn't communicate with.
Yep.
But after 10 months, I was able to come back fluent. But more importantly, I understood if you put the effort in, then you're going to get something out.
Yep.
Yeah, and so I was able to come back into New Zealand. I had to repeat the year that I was away for. They didn't let me go on. So my classmates graduated a year ahead of me.
You? Yep.
Yeah.
So then, there's a few things I want to obviously break down in that, right? So did you, so year 10 would have also been when did your work experience, or was that did you do that in year 9, did you say?
No, I came back and I think I did it in we didn't, unlike here, we do it in our year 11 year.
Okay, year 11 year. Okay. So then did you always have, what made you want to learn Japanese in the first place?
I think how the teacher taught it was really interesting.
Okay.
And it was just so fascinating because it's so different, different to anything.
Yep. And can you remember anything about that teacher's style that made it so interesting? Like what did they do differently compared to what your other teachers did?
I think the thing about learning a language is it's the culture and the people.
Yep.
So other subjects seem to just be facts on a page.
Yep.
Whereas the Japanese culture came alive through the stories that the teacher was able to share. So in that sense, it was a living, breathing thing that was beyond the shores, beyond my experience. And then the teacher arranged things like a trip to a restaurant, Japanese restaurant, so that we could get a sense of what we've been studying. Now it's, sitting in
food.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. And so then when you went to Japan on exchange, was that your first time away from home?
It was.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, apart from camps and when I was on holiday, that was, and I still can't believe that my mum let me go so far as a 15-year-old. I think that shows that she'd put a lot of trust in me and in the, that I was mature enough. But also that she was an adventurer. Later on I found out that she had left home on her 18th birthday to travel around Australia. So she was willing to offer me the same freedom that she had been given from her own family.
Yep. Okay. Wow. And so then when I'm always curious about this. So, you would have gotten on the plane, you're heading to Japan. What would have been going through your mind?
I think the enormity of what I was stepping into was suddenly real on that aeroplane. For me, just because of my family circumstances, I don't think things become real to me until they're actually happening. So I hadn't really geared up for what was going to happen until I was on the plane in the air and like, this is absolutely going to happen now. There's no turning back.
Yep. And then when you landed, obviously because you'd done some of the Japanese language lessons and you learn a little bit about the culture, I wouldn't say it would be a culture shock, but I think when you see, so many people, and then at the same time, I'm guessing you probably stood out a little. Yep. What was that like?
I was quite a shy person, so it was confronting to have people from other classrooms and other grades come to my classroom door to meet the foreigner.
Yeah.
I'd never been the centre of attention like that. In fact, I would always run from attention. Yeah, I didn't want that.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you're sort of thrust into the limelight and people want to engage with you. And I love that Japanese people's heart is to welcome people.
Yeah.
So I think we can learn a lot from that approach, that we can celebrate diversity.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then was there anything that, obviously when anything's new, you don't really, if you don't understand what's going on, it's all very interesting. But is there anything specific about Japanese culture that you think that you really liked?
I really love how they consider others before themselves. Yeah. I know that can put them in, my friends in difficult positions because instead of maybe being able to just make a choice, I want this, they'll look at a much bigger picture of, okay, well, how will my decision affect my family? How will it be seen by my neighbours and things like that? But I think they do have a really big thinking about the dynamics of a situation. It's not individualistic, it's much more group thinking.
Yeah. I think that's, in light of the whole COVID thing that we've been going through over the last year, right? Like countries like Japan, typically they always wore masks when they were sick anyway, right? And so I always found it odd, just the difference in mindset where it was like, I'm wearing the mask to protect myself, whereas, the Japanese mindset is that I'm going to wear the mask to protect others, right? Mm-hmm. So, even though if the outcome that you were chasing might have been the same, that everybody wears masks, just the way that you pitch it does make a really big difference. That's just my opinion, but that's what I thought about the whole situation.
Oh, I would totally agree with that. Yeah. And I tested out that theory one day because after I lived in Taiwan and then came back to Australia, I was very much in agreement with the mask culture. And I remember I had to pop into school for a couple of hours, and I wore a mask because I had the cold, I had the flu. And one of my colleagues said, why are you wearing a mask? Are you afraid that you're going to catch something from us? Because, the flu was going around. I said, no, I'm sick. I'm trying to stop you guys from getting it.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to get into the Taiwan part of it because, we haven't really talked about it yet, but for the listeners' sake, Jasmine's actually fluent in Chinese. So much so that, it surprises probably many people. But and I guess being in Hurstville, it's probably a fairly opportune thing, given, the large proportion of Chinese people in the area as well. So at what age did you end up going to Taiwan and what was that for?
Yeah, so I went in my 30s, and that was sort of on the back of a long journey towards from Japanese, also learning Chinese. After I came back from Japan, I finished high school. I went to uni, and I thought, this is great. There's so many subject choices far beyond what you get at high school. I can finally kind of find myself. And so I picked all these great subjects like sociology, history, poetry, doing an arts degree. And then I looked at my timetable. I just thought, this is so slack. At high school, you do from 8:30 till 3:30, and my timetable had nothing like that. So I thought, I want to really get my money's worth here. I picked up another subject. I thought, since languages at that time were worth double the university points, it would make sense to take on a second language. And I was just so naive. I thought, Japanese and Chinese, they're the same, or close enough. It'll be easy. It'll be an easy second language for me to try. And obviously the reality is a lot different. It's got tones. There's some character similarities, but sometimes that actually adds confusion rather than clarity.
Yeah, okay. So I always talk about this whenever it comes to languages and Eastern languages, right? That when you think about words that would have been around for a long time, so we think about the words for doctor, isan or isan, they're the things that always seem to have the carryover. It's all like the nuances as we go into the 20th century or later on when the cultures have been separate long enough that they form their own distinctions, right? But one of the other ones that I always like talking about is the word for rice congee, which is juk, which seems to be universal across any Asian culture, is that the word's juk. So I always find that funny as well. But like in terms of the characters, there's definitely similarities when you're looking at kanji characters versus Chinese characters, and the meanings are actually still the same meanings as well. I think from a sentence structure and grammatical standpoint, there are similarities, but they are their own iterations of language, right? And hence they form their own forms of culture. And while the architecture might look similar or there's similar aspects of it, when you get into the detail, they've really become their own trees. Yeah. So when you went to uni, and so then you picked up Chinese, and then what happened?
So I think the thing was, at that time, unfortunately, languages were kind of taught from the textbook. So it wasn't expected that Chinese would be the language of our classroom. And I had a really sort of textbook understanding of Chinese. I could read it, especially because of my Japanese background, but I wasn't great at using Chinese as sort of the language of interaction. And I have to say, I found learning characters really logical. I think I'm slightly dyslexic, and I found English really hard. Words they're not spelt like they sound, and they're silent letters, but kanji or characters just made a lot of sense to me, because of they're based on the ideas of what they're meant to be looking like, or they've got a code within them, or the words that are to do with emotions have the heart related to them. So it's kind of like every day it was trying to unlock this new part of a secret code. I was like a detective. After uni, my best friend and I decided that we would go backpack around China, because that's one way to put your Chinese to the test, right? To see what sort of trouble you can get yourself in and then out of. And I just remember being blown away, because the textbook did not cut it when you're working in places that have a strong accent or a dialect. It was just quite overwhelming, but at the same time exhilarating to be in China, the land that I had been reading about in my textbook, and suddenly now I've got to figure out what is that street seller selling? How much does it cost? And so it was being able to put it into action finally in a really meaningful way.
So where did you go on that trip?
Basically, we started in Beijing, and then we just did a big arc all the way through Western China. We went to Xi'an, we went to Chengdu, we went down into the south. So we just tried to get a really big coverage over 6 weeks. I know that doesn't do justice to a country that size, but yes, sort of the tourist trail, and saw a bit of Shanghai as well.
And how did you get around?
We backpack, so mainly trains and buses. And I remember we just did things as the locals did as much as possible. We didn't want to be the tourist on the tourist bus kind of thing. And because I could speak Chinese, we were able to do some more of those sort of local things.
Yeah.
I remember going to Shanghai, to Hong Kong at the end of it, because that's where we finished and we flew out from. And I was in culture shock.
Yep.
Because we were back to sort of the kind of big city style and clean streets, very organised. And, China has just got such variety. You're all squished in on the train, that kind of thing. And I almost couldn't deal with the vastness of the contrast from what we'd come out of from rural China and then back into the city, and everyone was on their mobile phones and their life was fast paced.
Yep. Okay. And then I guess, being a foreigner backpacking around China, like, it's probably not very common because obviously, I think it's obviously more common to see, like in Australia, we see European backpackers because they can at least speak English, they know the language. The entry cost of trying to do it into an Asian country, you need to learn the language, right? And if it's a vastly different language to what you're used to speaking, it becomes very difficult to pick up. What were some of the reactions of the people, as you guys were getting around?
I think that they were genuinely encouraged that people from this random little country, New Zealand, had taken the opportunity to learn language and then wanted to come and see for themselves what their country was like. And they were very proud to be able to put their country on display. Yep. And then some people were I'm pretty sure we were the first foreigners they'd ever met. I remember in this sort of very tiny town getting a haircut. And so it was sort of in one of those lift up garage door kind of places, hole in the wall. And these kids came home they were on their way home from school, and they looked inside and they saw me and then they kind of looked at each other, and I could see that they were kind of wildly excited and they had a chat. And then next thing, one of them pegged it in, grabbed a whole handful of my hair and then just ran away, because they were excited that there was this, different coloured hair.
Yep. It's funny. You just made me think of so I used to go to China quite a lot for martial arts competitions, and I remember this one time one of the guys that was with us, his name is Jeff, big Australian bloke, and we were there, and like there were some news outlets there, local news outlets there, and they were interviewing some of us, and then there was a whole bunch of kids that were around us, right? And poor Jeff was standing there, and the kids would be like, pulling at the hair on his arms, and he'd be like, "Hey, stop that!" like, because they're genuinely curious, right?
That's it.
If they hadn't seen, like, I think first of all, because Jeff's quite a tall guy, right, and then big sized guy, they were sort of looking at him and going, "Wow, people get this big," And then the second part was like, "Oh, he's quite hairy," You could hear them saying it in Chinese and pulling at the hairs on his legs and his arms, and he's just like, "Hey, stop that!" So yeah, it's I think it's always it's so odd how people can be so different, but we're all the same.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's like so much that goes into it from the standpoint of like, the cultural differences. Like what was your upbringing like? Like, so even like, if we say New Zealand versus Australia, there's so many differences, and obviously, people often group it as Oceania. And yeah, like we're, a stone's throw away, but, our accents are totally different.
Yep.
Right. And, I guess if you think about it from, for most, Anglos that have, that generational Anglos, like the English was probably the same at one point, but then it's diverged into two totally different accents. Yeah. So then, okay. So after uni, you did the trip to China. Then what did you do when you came back?
Yeah. So I really wanted to find a job where I thought I could put my language skills to the test. And I got this kind of dream job as a wedding planner for a company in Christchurch. I was really excited, for people who come from overseas and they want to have this fairy tale wedding with horse-drawn cart and castle and things like that.
Okay.
And so I'd secured it just before leaving university, but the company went bankrupt before I could start. And I was completely thrown by that. I was like, okay, everything that I had planned is now out the window. Yep. And I'm a Christian, so obviously I'm praying at this stage going, okay, God, well, that's a closed door, so I just trust that there's another door that's going to open. And I found a scholarship opportunity to go to Teachers College.
Okay.
and to be able to study to be a languages teacher. And I love sports, as I've mentioned. I played competitive basketball through high school and uni. So it was a great opportunity to put the two together and come out with a teaching qualification that meant I could be a PE teacher, PDHPE, as well as language teacher. Because often as a language teacher, you won't find a full-time role. But if you can combine it with another subject.
Oh, okay. And then you can teach both subjects.
That's it. And then you're flexible on the timetable for a school, because from year to year they might have a bit of variety. Yeah, so that's how I found myself in the classroom. And I went back, years later and looked at my yearbook, and it said things job, most likely job, and it had teacher beside there. I was like, oh wow, okay. That's interesting that was, written in my last year of high school, and here I am now, university graduate in the classroom. And I was really fortunate. Just randomly, I got to talk to this guy at a party before uni started, and he said, what are you doing? I told him, and he said, oh, you definitely need to go into this lecturer's tutor group. Like, he is a great lecturer. And his speciality was working with low socioeconomic areas. So in parts of New Zealand where, the income level of the family and the community are quite low. And so that can bring a whole lot of extra challenges for students. So I was able to train, and then I got a full-time position in the North Island in a place called Whanganui. So city of 40,000. I was in a massive high school of, I think, about 1,500 and really strong community, Māori community as well. So that was really great for me to come from the South Island that certainly at that time, didn't have that range of diversity. And get to understand a little bit more of Te Reo Māori, so the language and the tikanga, the culture of Indigenous Māori people.
And there's a real... it's almost like how, in terms of Indigenous Australians, right? Like no mob is identical. Like they all have their own nuances in language, and same thing, right? So we sort of categorize people into these groups, but there's so many different details, right? And so I guess between the North Island and the South Island in New Zealand, they're separated by water, so they would obviously have developed quite differently, yeah?
Yeah, I think probably one thing that was really helpful for the Māori people when white people came is that they had the same language, unlike here in Australia for Aboriginal people who have quite a diverse language. I understand that, this group couldn't understand this group, but that wasn't the case. So I think they have very distinct features in some cases, and then, but linguistically, they can communicate.
They still had some common ground. Okay. And then, so what was it like, being a teacher in this now school of about 1,500 students? Was it challenging? Was it? I guess the area that you were in, was it a middle class area? Was it a?
Yeah, it was. It was right on the border of an economically disadvantaged area, and so we had quite a range. And just on our back fence, we had a really prestigious boarding school, another school. Yeah, and so I think we had a very big contrast, and the management at the school, I think they brought that together really well, because that can obviously have its own challenges. Yeah, but I remember, I think the first month that I arrived there, obviously trying to fit in, and I think we had a shooting. We had a boy who was pushed off the bridge in a car accident. There was a third fatality, and I lived down the road from one of the gang headquarters. So it was stepping into quite a different sphere. I think that's something that New Zealand continues to grapple with is issues related to gangs.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you think that stems out of the income divide in terms of socioeconomic reasons, or? I think
it's not a simple answer. That's probably part of it, and I don't understand the full picture. I think there's a lot of disenfranchisement that can also lead to it, because one of the things that everyone wants is a sense of belonging, and I think that's something that whether it's gangs or other things that it offers.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. So from a teaching standpoint, do you remember any of the students that really challenged you, or do you look back on any of the students very fondly? There's some really good memories there.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the advantages of being a language teacher is although all the students had to do a language at first, beyond what we call year 9, then the students were able to make a choice if they wanted to opt in for languages. So in that sense, I got to work with those students for 5 years of high school, and often language classes were slightly smaller. So I still keep in touch with some of those students. Oh, really? It's really lovely to see them as adults. And the other thing was, I wasn't just a high school teacher. I also was a volunteer at my church. So we had a youth group, and it was lovely to be able to see kids adapt really well to, okay, I know her as my teacher in this context, but over here she's part of youth group.
Yep. Okay. I'm gonna come back and we'll keep going in terms of the journey, right? But I want to pause there and talk a little bit about faith. So did you grow up? You say your household was quite Christian? No,
I'm not from a Christian family at all. You know how I was able to go to Japan?
Yep.
When I came back, my school employed me as like a translator for the Japanese students who came. We had quite a big international department, and just to help them sort of get settled in.
Yep.
And through that, I got to meet students from all around the world. I made friends with these 2 beautiful students from Thailand. They invited me to go back for a summer at the end of my year 11 year. And that was incredibly eye-opening, because I thought, I've been overseas, I kind of know what that experience is like, but I didn't have the wisdom to understand countries can be so different, even if they're sort of all in that one particular region. And my Thai friends, I hadn't appreciated, but that their family was really well off.
Yep.
And yet, just outside their gate, there were people who didn't have all their limbs, and they were begging for food and things like that. So that was really confronting for me. And I was trying to grapple with what that looks like. How do we as humans respond to suffering? So I said to one of my friends, you guys have got so much money. How do you cope with this? And I guess for Buddhists, the idea of reincarnation is very crucial. And they said, well, these people are in this position because they've done something in their previous life. And so, this is them living out that karma. And so we're not actually responsible for that. They have to learn their lesson through that. But I couldn't comprehend that.
Yep.
How do we look at human suffering and justify it and not be moved? So I wanted to understand my friend's perspective. I read a Buddhist book, and then when I got back, I bought a book about, I think there were 6 other main religions. I thought I'll buy a book of each and I'll just start working my way through to understand. So I was quite an ambitious, 16, 17-year-old trying to figure out these big issues. I got through, I think, half of the next major religion book, and I went to a World Vision conference.
Okay.
So World Vision in New Zealand is really big. They do the 40-hour famine. Lots of high school kids get on board. They want to raise money to help kids around the world. And so my school was really into that. And I met a missionary, and she shared a little bit of her faith journey. And at that point, I was just like, I know that at my core, I'm not a good person. Like, I'm not living out my best life. I'm a sinner, to use a kind of Christian word. And so I just really convicted that I needed to change my life. And that's when I said the prayer or became a Christian, whatever sort of words you want to put around it.
Yep.
And that was quite confronting for my family, because they
never
didn't
had that.
No. So suddenly it was like, well, what does that mean?
Yeah. So from your family's perspective, like, so they weren't religious at all. They didn't have any sort of superstition, nothing like that.
No.
Yep.
No, nothing.
Okay. And then so what was that like? Having to go home and say, Mum, I think I'm a Christian, or I am a Christian.
Yeah, I've become a Christian. Yeah. Well, I think my mum's a really supportive person, so she took that in her stride. But it was also working out, okay, well, what does that mean? So to grow in my faith, and then to put it into practice. That's a lifelong journey, and I was really glad that my parents were gracious in that space to kind of let me figure it out without any pressure.
Yeah. So I think that's that is always going to be an individual's journey, right? Like, some people may live their whole lives and never find any faith. Others, are born into it. Some, find it, like yourself, somewhere along the lines. Was there anything that you read or that you found helpful in your journey?
I think the most helpful thing is finding people who are willing to live out an authentic relationship with Jesus. So it's not just a nice idea, but it's actually where the rubber meets the road. So if you're going to follow Jesus, then it's going to mean some sacrifice on your part to love generously and to give of yourself.
Yeah, I think that applies to anything in life, right? Like, if you want to achieve something in any discipline, you need to have, and sometimes you could say it's sacrifice, but it depends on how you approach it, right? So sacrifice to some is not sacrifice to others. Like, if you enjoy it, it's something that you're passionate about. It doesn't mean that you have to suffer, so to speak. But I guess that's all in the mindset side of it, right? Like, some people think that they view suffering as something that, we do need to endure. And look, I don't really know what the right answer is there. I think it's a mix of everything, because, you need the highs and you need the lows, because without each one, you don't appreciate the other.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So then, okay, so going back to then, how did you end up, because you're teaching now, how did you get to, I've still got two gaping hole questions of, like, how did the Taiwan thing come out? And then how did you end up in Australia?
Yeah. So I was married at the time, and my husband was studying to be a minister.
Okay.
But the small town that we lived in, it was unlikely that he was going to be able to find a position. So then the question became, well, okay, what does that mean? Then maybe we could end up anywhere.
Yep.
And I had, I love that this is kind of a general difference between the genders. I had a hard day at school, and my principal had made quite a big decision that I thought affected my students in an adverse way, and also me. And I came home and I shared that. And then my husband, wanting, in love to fix the situation, went online and found, some jobs to apply for. Yeah. I just wanted to let off steam, but his heart was, if this isn't working, then we can
find something better.
Yeah. Yep. And he found this incredible job here in Sydney at St. George Christian School. And I just thought, okay, why not? Let's see. We're probably going to have to move anyway. Yep. So I applied and sent off the application, not knowing if this was going to mean our time in New Zealand would finish. And it worked out that that year all my holidays were busy. Like, I had a school trip that I was taking our kids to China, and I thought, well, I'm not going to get the chance to, if I get called, shortlisted for an interview, to go and interview face to face. That's a bit of a disadvantage. And so I contacted the principal ahead of the sort of applications closing and said, look, I'm actually coming through Sydney on a stopover.
Yep.
If at all you think that I might be a candidate, could you meet me for an hour just to put the name and the face together?
Yep.
And so I was really fortunate. I think that was, when you get to meet a person and, like, face to face, and you get to see not just what they are on paper, but who they are as a person.
Yeah, and I think that would have resonated for him as well. Like, I don't think there would have been many other candidates that would have reached out and done those sorts of things. Like, I find that all the time, as a running a business, that when we're trying to find applicants to apply for roles, sometimes you get inundated, like absolutely inundated. Your inbox has got like 50 applicants, and you have to sift through each of those applicants and try and work out who's going to be suitable to be called in and whatever. So, sometimes we develop these really absurd rules about, who you accept and don't accept. Oh, look, no cover letter. Okay, you're out. Or, you didn't change the name on this or that and you're out, So, I can sympathize on both levels, because obviously as an applicant, you don't really know. You're sort of playing the numbers, right? So a lot of people approach it from that perspective of, I'm going to play the numbers and apply for as many jobs as possible, and whatever I get is whatever I get. But to an employer, the person that has spent the time and invested the time into doing those things right, and then, potentially even making those phone calls and reaching out, like, that stands out above the rest automatically, because that person has done more to basically elevate themselves in the crowd. So then you went, and obviously you would have gone and done your trip in China, taking these kids for a wonderful time. What city did you go to, out of curiosity?
So we went to Shanghai, Beijing, and Xi'an. Yeah, I think, kind of the big the sort of ones. The main ones.
And how did you find the kids react to it?
I think that's a thing, like, even though I'd gone by that stage a couple of times, that it was really refreshing to watch them discover the things that I remember just blew my mind.
Yeah.
And to really see what they'd been learning come alive, to be able to go, oh, you remember when we did the numbers unit and I pulled out the money for you guys to, be able to try practice your counting. Well, now here it is, so go and spend it, go buy something with it, try your negotiating skills, see if you can, lower the price. Yeah.
So you taught them how to haggle.
Absolutely. You can't survive without those skills.
Yeah, it's the Chinese way.
Yeah. And even that's really foreign because, we come from a society where the price tag is the price tag. You don't negotiate. And I remember my mum being horrified. I came back from Japan and I had all these, the old days where you had film canisters. And I remember thinking, oh, if that's the price per canister, I'm going to be paying a fortune. And so I just said, what's your best deal that you can give me? Yeah. And she was like, you don't ask that. I was like, well, I've got nothing to lose.
Yeah. If you don't ask, and that's the thing. I think when it comes to negotiation, everybody always gets a bit bent out of shape. Sometimes it's just a matter of asking a question. If the answer is no, it's not as long as you're not rude about it. Yeah. As long as you approach it in the right spirit and you're not rude about it. I think there's nothing wrong with asking. At the end of the day, it's the old you don't ask, you don't get. But it is I can understand why it's very off-putting for some people, especially it's not the norm, right? It is the norm in the car sales industry.
Of course.
Everybody always wants a better deal, but look, that's the nature of the business as well. So it's funny we accept it from that perspective, right? But we don't. We wouldn't accept it if somebody wanted to go to the supermarket and say, "Oh, I only want to pay you $1 for this bread." When it's $1.30 or $2 or whatever.
That's it. And I think for me, wrestling with the fact that, what if there are two prices? Yeah. What if there's the price that the locals give their regular customers? Yeah. And when I come as a foreigner, that there's a different price.
Oh, 100%. In China, it's guaranteed.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. The funniest was when on one of my trips, I think we were doing a tour of some sort, and some of the students wanted to buy some ice cream or something like that. So they've all bought ice cream for $1, Chinese money, and then some local kids came up and it was 20 cents, and I was just watching the transaction, and I was just standing there watching it unfold right in front of my eyes. It's but what can you say? You can't really say anything. It is what it is.
That's true. And then I think as long as you're willing to go, to have a bit of fun with it, because I always wanted to see, could I figure out what the local price was? Yeah. And then could I get it for the local price? Yeah. And if not, that's fine. Yeah. But, let's test my skills. So I developed a few plans. I'd often stand beside the street vendors, just a little bit further away, and I'd watch, them sell it to a local person. I go, oh, okay, so that's what they handed them. That's the amount of change that they got back. Let's see when I go. Yeah. And the other thing I remember doing just to test my language skills was going for a haircut. Every time I go to China, I would get a haircut, and I figured the better the haircut, then that would show that my Chinese was improving, because I could actually articulate what I wanted.
Okay, that's pretty cool. So then was there any times when it did it work, the standing on the side and seeing what the locals paid? Did that work for you? Or
yeah, it did. Yeah. And I think because they knew that I knew the price. Yeah. So
yeah. So they didn't bother to try. Yeah. Okay. And it probably also helps that you're speaking to them in Chinese as well, right?
And again, like what you said, not it's not rudeness. Yeah. We're having a bit of fun in this interaction.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So then when did you find out that you got the job?
Yeah, so it must have been towards the end of the year, and that just was, how do you pack up your whole life? How do you then move everything overseas? And I was fortunate because by that stage I had already had a sabbatical in China for 10 months. I'd lived in Xi'an, and so
sorry, so you lived in Xi'an for 10 months. What were you doing?
So the New Zealand government was offering opportunities for language teachers to go overseas.
Okay.
And this is one of the things I tell my language students, languages will open doors. Like you might want to be an accountant, but you might also have a second language that opens some extra doors for you. And so I was fortunate, like as I mentioned, I got a scholarship to go to Teachers College. I went to live in Xi'an for the 10 months. That was on a scholarship. I got paid my New Zealand teacher's salary while I was over there and all my living costs, and I went to university. Yep. And then, at some stage I'll share a bit more about Taiwan, but that was also on a scholarship. So I've been really fortunate in that regard. And it was great because I was learning language, but I was also in a local school to see how Chinese teachers teach as a high school teacher, to kind of be able to draw on the best of what they were doing as their practice and be able to bring that back to New Zealand.
And was there any major differences that you found?
Oh, look, I walked into a classroom that had 90 kids.
Wow.
And I just thought that's
what a ratio.
That's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But I think what really stood out was that kids were dedicated to education opening up a pathway for them. They understood that that was going to be the main way that they were going to change their circumstances, and I think their parents really encouraged them to make the most of their educational opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's a common thing for kids nowadays, is that we still don't, and even as myself as a kid, when I think back as, growing up in Australia, like I didn't really link, everything together to go and say, well, I need to do well at this to achieve this in life, or and look, I was fortunate enough to go to good schools and be in the right universes. When I say the culture of the school was very academic as well. So I was really fortunate from that perspective, but I can see how it could very easily go the opposite way. Depending on your peers and what's important, to be cool, can really dictate what happens in school. Talking about Xi'an, like, was there anything that you really loved in particular about that city?
Well, I loved living on campus.
Okay.
To be in the dorms. So I was in a foreigners dorm, unlike my Chinese peers, where, some of the girls had 6 to a room, the boys had 10 or 12, and just living really in close proximity. And I loved, university life. I could roll out of bed at 5 to 8. I could pick up my bag of doljang and, being on the way to class.
Yep.
And everything was in close proximity. But it's also about the community, because everyone is really friendly. You get to know a whole lot of people.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. And so then when it came to packing up your life and moving to Sydney, how did you work out where you're going to stay?
Yeah, well, actually, I was really fortunate because my brother was in the army and he came back just as I was going.
Okay.
And so it's hilarious. He managed to get a big, what's called a Unimog, like a big flat deck truck. He just drove it 2 hours, and we loaded everything that we had apart from personal stuff onto the truck, and he drove it away.
Yep.
And then we took our suitcases to the airport.
Okay.
And our school asked around. One of the teachers who lived in Cronulla, just a street back from Shelley Beach, said that she was willing to host us for the first term.
Yep.
So I went from New Zealand to this 40,000 person town to living right on Shelley Beach and being able to go down to the beach every day after school. Yep. I just thought, wow, Australians.
What a life.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not all like that, unfortunately. The further west you go, the less beaches you got. So that's a pretty good introduction though to Australian lifestyle. So then how did you end up in Taiwan then? Yeah,
so I had, this is the language teacher's problem. Every time you're sick, what are your students going to do, right? Because
there's no other language teachers, right?
Yeah, there's no. In my school, there wasn't at that time. And so to kind of bulletproof that lesson, because you didn't want the students sort of bored or anything, I would often try and find a movie that the kids could watch. Because I also think if you can see it, then you can dream it.
Yep.
If you can see what life is like in another country, or you can see what it's like when people are using Chinese or Japanese. And so I watched this movie about Yao Ming, the famous NBA basketball star from China. And what was really interesting, his story in itself is interesting, but he had a translator from the US who went to Taiwan to study Chinese. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't thought really about, there's other Chinese speaking countries.
Yep.
That I could go and visit. So I just started really thinking about, well, what would it, could I go to Taiwan for study? And I found the government offers this wonderful scholarship that you can then take it and you can pick the university of your choice.
Yep.
And I thought that's something I'm really, really interested in. And so through a series of sort of amazing opportunities, I resigned my job, but not having the scholarship yet.
Yep.
And I took a bit of a sabbatical because I was quite exhausted, and I made my scholarship application because, you've got to pull together all of these sort of essays and explain why you are a candidate. And as someone older,
yep.
That time in my 30s, late 30s, for another government to invest in a year of paying for my university fees and living costs, it's kind of a big ask.
Yeah.
And so I was really excited though that to be able to live in Taiwan and understand a little bit more of Taiwan's culture, history. And I think too, like if I was wanting to learn English and I'd only gone to one place, like let's say the States, then I would miss out on the fullness of Western or English-speaking countries because the States is one part of that story.
That's right.
So to be able to contrast it was a really important thing for me to have a balanced view, especially as a Chinese teacher.
Yep.
I want to be able to give the full experience for my students.
And so when you went to Taiwan, did they comment on your accent?
Yeah, they did. And what I wasn't ready for, and we're aware of this as English speakers, you know, it's the pavement or it's the footpath or it's the sidewalk.
Yep.
But I hadn't thought that Chinese would have that.
Yep.
And suddenly they're talking about, you know, 自行车, and it's not like 垃圾 versus 垃圾.
Yeah.
And it was great to be able to go, oh, well, even something like a mouse is called something different.
Yeah. Yeah, there's all these little nuances. Yeah. Like I'm not hip with any of the slang. You know, my Chinese has become probably degraded over the years anyway to my children's level. You know, because I just generally speak to my kids in Chinese nowadays. Even from a business context, I typically try and avoid speaking Chinese in a business context because I'll get some things wrong. And it's like sometimes I've had no choice, and then it's like then I'll prefer to, you know, get onto Weixing and do it that way, because then at least I'll just dictate to it, so then it'll like type out everything I need to say, as opposed to trying to, you know, look up the characters and Google Translate and all that sort of stuff. But there's ways around it. But yeah, it's not easy. And I think you know, even in like I think my dad was making this comment to me about even back in Singapore, they've got a shortage of business level Mandarin speakers, you know, because everybody just speaks Mandarin conversationally. Like we're just talking to our parents or families and friends. We're not really talking about it in the business context. And, you know, the kind of speeches that I do in English for work and things like that, I would struggle to have that level of formality in speaking it in Chinese. You know, I think there's it's like almost like a separate language in itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay. And so then how did that, what were some of the things that you really enjoyed about Taiwan?
Well, the people, I think that's probably going to be my comment for no matter where I go in the world, it is about the people. But I just felt like I had found the New Zealand of Asia, because people were just random. They were super, super friendly.
Yeah.
And, you know, whether I'm stopped on the street waiting for the lights, people would chit-chat and say, hey, where you're from. My university teachers were super friendly and encouraging. So we weren't just students, you know, they genuinely cared about us. I remember one time we just, during monsoon season, it was complete downpour. I was like, oh, if I don't go now, I'm not going to make it to class. And so I set off on my bike with my raincoat, but by the time I arrived, I was soaking wet. And so, you know, my teacher sent me to the office and said, oh, they've got a hairdryer, you know, like go and get dry, then come back. Yeah. Yep. And that my teacher would always, you know, bring some sweet treats or something like that. So just being able to have, I guess, almost like a family away from home, so that it didn't feel quite so lonely being so far away.
And so each time that you were away, you know, in these foreign countries, did you find a place of worship or?
Yeah, I mean, China's obviously interesting because I can't worship with nationals.
Yep.
I remember one time I went to a big church and they have different services. So to get into the foreigners service, you need to show that you have a foreign passport, and they will let you in. And then when it's time for the national, like Chinese people to have their worship service, everyone has to leave, and then the Chinese people are allowed in.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So just and I'm not sure if that's the case for all of the churches, but that's how that church ran in Shanghai. And my friend left something in the church, so I needed to go back in, and it was interesting because it was quite a different style. So when I was in Xi'an, we just did like home church. In Taiwan, I went to a local church, and that was really great. I didn't know which church to go to. I was like, there's so many, how do I know? And I just was in the canteen at lunchtime, and I bowed my head to say grace, and then the person who happened to be sitting across from me started up a conversation, said, oh, you're a Christian? And then he said, I'm a Christian. So I got to go along to his church. And they were really warm and welcoming.
Yep. That's pretty cool. It's like, it's finding those common grounds no matter where you are. Like that's really nice. So then, okay, so after Taiwan, then you obviously would have come back to Australia. You weren't working at the school anymore.
No. Yeah. Actually, what had happened is just before I had put my application in, I noticed. I had started my own business in the break with a friend from Toastmasters.
Okay.
Because I had...
so there's a whole Toastmasters section in here.
Yeah, there is.
So
we don't make toast, by the way. A few of my friends thought that that's what it's about.
Yeah, so Toastmasters is obviously it's a group designed around getting people more comfortable with public speaking, right? So you did Toastmasters before you went away, or?
Yeah, I had done it maybe I think about in 2011. My husband at the time, he wanted to be a minister, but his shyness was really something that he would need to gain some confidence. So I said, there's this thing called Toastmasters. We could go along, and my plan was just for me to go with him and him to get settled, and then off he would go. Yep. But I realised it's just an amazing opportunity. So I stayed, I think, in Toastmasters probably for about 5 years, and I went all the way through to Distinguished Toastmasters.
Okay.
And there's just so many incredible opportunities. And one of them was that myself and another Toastmasters, we started just a very small business aimed at people who were coming out of sort of tertiary education and they wanted to nail a job interview. They wanted to know, how do I write my resume? So what we were talking about, so it's going to get noticed.
Yep.
And then once I get to job interview stage, how do I make sure that I'm going to nail my job interview? So I did a lot of research on that because we were doing seminars. And I thought, I just am interested, someone like me, what kind of jobs are out there at the moment? So I think I typed in Chinese Japanese speaker, and then it turned out that this church just down the road from me was looking for a community minister, community pastor. So I rang up and I said, hey, this is who I am, and I'd actually taught the minister's kids.
Oh, really?
So it was a nice connection. But they said, we think we're almost sort of at the point of offering a position to the other person. I said, okay, well, that's fine, but they took my name anyway, and then a couple of weeks later they got back in touch and said, I'd be interested just to meet for a coffee. So I told them I've got a scholarship application and I don't know if that how that might affect your decision. Yeah. And they were really gracious. They said, no, we're interested, and we're willing to hold the position open for you, while you're away, for you to come back into that once you've finished studying.
Yeah, wow. That's really good.
Yeah, they were fantastic.
So then that's what you went into when you came back? Yep.
Yeah. So I'd had probably about 4, 5, 6 months here at Hurstville Church of Christ.
Yep.
And then left. I had 18 months away and then came back to the position.
Oh, that's really good. And then so in what you do now, what is it that you enjoy about ministry?
It's the people. Yeah. It's the fact that we're all imperfect, broken lives, but the choice to journey together in that brokenness and get to know each other, be vulnerable, just to share life. Yeah, I think we've got some great programs that bring our community together. So like the Toddler Time program on Wednesday, and we have free English class on Saturday. Because, people are living in these apartments around us. But then, and this was my question, when I've come from overseas into a new place, how is it that I'm going to have meaningful connections? And sort of university offered that because there's sort of this instant community. But what if you don't have that?
Yep.
And I played sport when I was in Taiwan. I was always down at the basketball court, so I had sort of sports friends, basketball friends. But for other people, especially some of the older people who come to maybe look after their grandchildren, and English isn't their first language, and they're still learning.
Yep.
How do we bring them into a space where they can maybe get to know a few people?
Yep.
They can improve their English. They can just meet some people.
Yeah. That connection piece is always So, and I think, Andrew's listening to like this, like a webinar, I guess, and it was just talking about, talking about how to communicate with kids and things like that. And one of the things that I really liked, because she would send me some of the slides and we talk about it, and I like stealing all these little ideas from all the different places so that I can try and put into practice in my own, workplace environment. And one of the concepts that they were talking about was like, if you view your communication like a bucket, right? And so you've got different elements that you can put into the bucket. So, you can choose to connect with somebody. You can choose to be directive in your action, or you can choose to correct them, say, oh, you're wrong and you need to do it this way. And so I guess the context of the webinar was more like, think about how you want your kids to remember you, and do you want them to just remember you as being somebody who was always angry all the time and yelling at them and raising your voice and, always being very directive, or do you want to have that really strong connection with your kids? And I took that away, and I was actually thinking about it, in my own life and from that context, right? Because like when I sort of think back on some of the things that I remember at home, I do remember those times when it was raised voices and yelling and fighting and all that sort of stuff. And it's funny how there are happy times too, but they're the prominent ones that immediately spring to mind. So when I was reflecting on that, then I was like, okay, I need to think about that from a work context as well. How do my people view me as a boss or a mentor? Yeah. Right? Do I really have a solid connection with these people, or is it just only from a very surface level because I'm the boss and they're the employees or whatever, or the managers, and they have to do what I ask? Or have I really connected with them so that we actually understand each other and we know why we're trying to work towards this outcome? Yeah. And I really, I guess one of the things that I think about as a result of that is that, so I think, if we think about the definition of the word church, right, it just means a group of people coming together. Yeah. So, even a workplace is like a church, right? You've got a group of individuals who are coming together for a similar purpose. Obviously the purpose is different compared to, going to actual church. But it doesn't mean that we can't have more fulfilled lives as a result of it. And so I always think about that now, because, I know there's been certain periods in my career where I've been very hollow. It's like, I'm in this job and I'm not quite enjoying it anymore. And so that to me is always a red flag to say, hey, there must be something else. Yeah. Right. And I guess, in terms of you, talking about from the faith aspect, you're seeing these people going through these hardships and suffering, and it made you think, hey, there must be something else, right? So I always enjoy that, thinking about those things, that there's so many similarities that are across all the pathways. We don't always see it, right? Yeah. And like, I know Ange will often say that, sometimes, she goes through life and then it's like only when you look back can you see, the workings of, God or whoever, the power or whatever, making its way through your life. Yeah. But, I look at it from the other perspective of, if we can all just work on getting 1% better each day of our lives, like, and not in reference to somebody else, but in reference to who, I was as a person yesterday versus who I am as a person today. If I'm that little bit better, then that's the only yardstick that I ever really need to worry about. Is my relationship with my wife, 1% better today, or my kids and my workers and my people. And so they're the things that I sort of look at. Is that something that you resonate with, from a church perspective?
Yeah, and I think though probably for me the challenge is, because I do want to do that. I want to love better, but also knowing that my ability to do that is insufficient to the challenge, and so that's really where Jesus needs to come into that space for me to go, I can't do it. And even if I did it my way, it wouldn't be enough, because I've got my own motives. As much as I want to try not for them to come to the fore, I'm still a person with my broken humanity, in play in that space. So, and I think that's one of the other aspects of my job is also, it's great because people come sometimes with a particular understanding of religion, and being able to hold that and respect that, but also go, well, here for me, it's not a religion. It's actually following Jesus. It's the personhood of Jesus, and being able to open the Bible, look at the stories of who Jesus is. He loves the vulnerable. He loves the broken. He goes into those spaces. He's willing to stand up against sort of the religious authority and call out some behaviors that aren't okay.
then from a denomination perspective, right? Like, what's your sort of viewpoint on that? Because there's so many different Christian denominations, whether it's Catholicism or Christianity or Protestant or, and I know that, like I was having this conversation even just last night. I was talking to a friend who grew up as a Muslim, right? And I had this other conversation with another guy who's a client, and he gave me a copy of the Quran because we were talking about it, and I was curious, so I said, yeah, and he goes, I'll give you a copy, and I was like, okay, fantastic. I'll have a read, and then we can have a conversation about it. And like, so the other, like when I brought it home, Angela's like, what are you doing with this? Right? Like her first reaction was like a bit of shock, right? I'm like, oh, it doesn't hurt to just, read and understand perspectives, right? And, then I was like reading some of the first few pages, and she was looking at the contents with me, and she's like, oh, this story's, in the Bible as well. And so there's a lot of crossover between, I guess, Islam and Judaism and Christianity. I guess, from your perspective or from the things that you've uncovered and learnt over the years, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think my shallow understanding, because I haven't studied those other religions in depth, is that the starting place is probably is similar. And then I guess the question I kind of bring it back to is, what do they do with the person of Jesus? Where does Jesus sit for them? Because to me, Jesus is far more than a good teacher, someone who calls us to lead a good life where we love God, love our neighbours as ourselves. He's when I read the pages of the Bible, he says that he is the way, the truth, and the life. He is actually Emmanuel. So, he is God with us. That's sort of what we sing in the Christmas carols. So then understanding, okay, well, for other religions, how is
that person or
the
that
person of Jesus, and so, his calling on our lives to love.
So, okay, so on that, right, so and you'll probably be able to correct me on this, but so Jesus as a figurehead of Christianity is important because, he's the proclaimed Son of God, correct?
Yeah.
And the reason why he's so important is because essentially, he took on everybody else's sin to basically absolve us of sin or something, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it goes back to the fact that as humans, we want our own way.
Yep.
And another word for that is rebellion. So in terms of how God wanted us to live our lives and how we're actually living it, there's a big gap. And that gap is sin. It's us putting ourselves in the driver's seat. So because God's holy, then that sin prevents us from drawing close to him. So as you say, when Jesus died, bore our sins on the cross, that makes a way back for us into relationship. And I find that's the good news, is that God wants a relationship with us. We get it wrong, but he loves us even despite our frailty, our brokenness. And so Jesus shows us that the Father was willing to not absolve us of our sin. It still has a consequence, but he was willing to take that consequence so that we could come back into relationship. As late as I think it's the world's most beautiful love story. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. All right. Well, I think we've used up our hour. But is there anything that else you want to talk about? Or?
No, I love it. You've got such a range of visitors on your podcast. It's really, good on you, Johnny, for doing this.
No, that's all right. It's my pleasure. Look, at the end of the day, I've probably said this many a time, but I started because I had a friend who committed suicide a couple of years ago. It's actually coming up to around that time when he did it. It was just after Easter, 2 years ago. I guess it's kind of an odd feeling when I think about it, just from the perspective that, it almost sometimes doesn't feel real, and I guess because, it's not like, we would talk probably say every other month kind of a thing, so every now and then when I'm in the car driving, we'd call and we'd have a bit of a conversation. And it's not like, I guess for me, it wasn't like, it's not a gaping hole from the perspective of, we weren't dealing with each other on an everyday basis, because obviously we were living our own lives as well. But it's odd enough, when I stop and think about it, that it's like, oh, you know, he's not there. So, you know, I don't know. Sometimes I reflect on it and I just go, it's a funny fear. It's a funny how, you know, time just moves, you know, like it's been 2 years already. And, you know, like I can still remember those emotions of when it all happened. But they're not, you know, they're not raw like they were back then. So yeah, anyway, so that was the like how it all began. And then, you know, I got on this pathway of, you know, wanting to hear other people's stories, and, you know, I've just been doing it ever since. So
I think it's fantastic, and I actually think this kind of thing, I've done it in other settings like retreat. I know some of the people who are part of that retreat, their story more deeply than I know my own friends, because when you sit down for a concentrated period of time and you ask great questions and you get to kind of dig around and find out what drives people, what their experiences are. It's a really beautiful thing, because there's some vulnerability in that space, right?
Yeah, and it's not, and we don't do it enough. You know, a lot of the times a lot of the conversations are very, you know, at face value, you know, and like there's no substance to it, and I don't actually enjoy, you know, those sort of small talk conversations as much anymore. Maybe because I'm spoilt and I do this sort of medium, but, you know, when I can actually sit down and hone in on a conversation, that's what I really enjoy, because there's so many things that you learn from what other people have done, and there's, you know, provided you're open-minded about it, there can be a lot of things that you can learn. There's perspectives that you probably never considered before. There's experiences that, you know, you don't have the emotions to connect with because you've never experienced those things. And I think, you know, there's also an element which can drive motivation as well, right? Like it inspires you to chase those other things or try those new experiences that you wouldn't otherwise want to do.
And there's some beautiful lessons. Like I think that's one of the things. Like I won't have the opportunity to do some things, but I can learn from other people, and they've got a lot of wisdom to bring into that space.
Yep, you learn from everyone. You know, sometimes you learn what to do, and sometimes you learn what not to do. So, all right, we'll leave it at that.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Thanks for coming on.